Alejandro arrived shortly after 8 in his own open-top sports car, a vintage '93 Dodge Viper in racing red. He honked his horn to gain Antonia's attention, and she looked up, suitably impressed. Alejandro was his usual poker-faced self and, because he was wearing mirrored shades and a black silk short-sleeved shirt, she could not read his eyes or gauge his mood. She rose quickly from the table in the cafe, picking up her bags, and walking briskly to join him as he revved his throaty V10 engine. As with all men in Miami, such supercars were for show rather than speed, as there was no place to exercise such potency. Men seeking to impress women had to do so with displays of wealth, muscularity, and influence. Antonia hopped into the passenger seat and they headed north along Collins Avenue to meet Paco. The early evening warmth rushed across Antonia's face and through her hair as they took the scenic road up to the end of Miami Beach. Alejandro then took a left onto Hallandale Beach Boulevard, and they immediately hit heavy traffic and inched their way towards Paco's nocturnal headquarters, one set of lights at a time. She knew better than to try to engage in conversation with Alejandro. He was Paco's eyes and ears, and clearly loyal to him. She could sense that he wanted more, but he knew his place and that place was good. Perhaps this man of few words was a man of intelligence, although it was hard to tell for sure. Antonia, however, did not doubt that he was ruthless, and would not hesitate to inform Paco of any misstep she might make. After almost an hour spent absorbing a ride through a cross-section of Miami, from haute couture to cheap and tawdry malls, they arrived at Paco's Pink Pussycat Club. After parking in the VIP section of the car park, merely a dozen yards from the understated entrance, they hopped out and Antonia raised her shopping bag to signal to her chaperone that she had to change outfits. Alejandro nodded affirmatively and led her through security, slapping hands with the 2 security guards who manned either side of the door. They retraced the uninspiring 50 paces through the dark corridor, with pink neon LED strips marking where the walls met the ceiling, although, on this occasion, Antonia noted that the ceiling itself contained hundreds of tiny spotlights that gave a very fake and rather cheap approximation of a starry night sky. This club was very tacky, and certainly unrefined, mused Antonia. But there again, that was true of so much of an American society which many in Cuba considered vulgar. At least she had been spared the prospect of becoming one of Paco's showgirls, and exerting herself to titillate faceless Americans in lofty booths. Once inside Paco's cathedral of decadence, Alejandro pointed her attention towards a black door with the club's pink logo on it, and she pushed it open. Immediately she was confronted by a buzz of sound and a blaze of light as a dozen dancers, in various states of undress before their illuminated makeup mirrors, chewed gum, gossiped and checked their smartphones. A sudden wave of realization came across her, and she began to reimagine Paco's intentions for her. She found an unoccupied space in front of a mirror and started to change without formally introducing herself. Suddenly, a muscular Caucasian woman in her early 30s with long black hair and visibly augmented breasts interrupted her, advancing menacingly to put the young interloper in her place.
Hey chica. Scram. That's Oksana's place.
Fortunately for Antonia, Paula stepped from the crowd and placed a firm hand on Rena's shoulder, halting her advance.
Hey Rena, wait up. C'est Paco's new girl.
A vacuous expression came over Rena's face, although she stopped short of a verbal apology.
Oh, okay, Paula.
Rena responded, crestfallen and subdued.
Hey everyone. This is Tonian's cheese one cool bonita.
Paula purred with pleasure as she introduced her friend and lifted her fallen chin with her fingers. The entire dressing room paused their various activities and conversations and shouted,
Hi, Tony.
Hey, Tony.
Hi, Tony.
Antonia smiled. A seemingly strange and hostile environment had suddenly been transformed into a place of warm welcome.
Hello, everyone.
Antonia responded positively, placing her shopping bag on the chair in front of the brightly illuminated mirror that tells no lies. The dancers continued their preparations, many in their birthday suits, admiring themselves in the mirrors and complimenting one another liberally. while Antonia changed into her Invisalign lingerie and figure-hugging pink dress, which was open at the left side and could be pulled down to a level just below the hips that preserved precious little modesty. After completing the look with a pair of sylph-like pink stilettos and some finishing touches to her makeup, Antonia turned to the throng for approval and was greeted with a chorus of catcalls and compliments.
You go, girl.
Cried one, in a cliched acknowledgement.
Yo. Bella donna.
Yelled another.
You too good for mortal man, chica.
Hollered a third. Paula just smiled and winked at Antonia, and Antonia simply smiled back, blushing visibly. Gathering her bags, Antonia waved farewell with fresh confidence and headed back out through the inconspicuous black door to find Paco, as the dressing room buzzed with gossip about the boss's new girl. To her surprise, Paco was standing outside the door waiting for her, and he looked her up and down in an overt show of sexual approval, an expression of intent written across his grinning visage. He stepped to one side and bid her to follow him up to his eagle's nest up in the ring of the highest tier. As he did so, he clicked his fingers and a hostess ran up to him, and he placed his order into her ear above the loud beat of the bass speakers, which caused the stage and walls to reverberate to its commanding frequency. Once at the summit, he invited her to sit down between himself and Alejandro. After a minute, the signature pink cocktails arrived, and Paco handed out the glasses and raised a toast.
Do a job well done.
Antonia and Alejandro followed his lead and clinked their glasses, his loyal lieutenant even mustering a wry smile. Paco then sat down and turned his attentions exclusively to Antonia.
You did good, Tony. Very professional. Thank you. Did you pick up your reward?
Antonia nodded, feigning gratitude, although she now realized that the envelope she had picked up from reception and spent on her outfit was her paycheck and not simply pocket money as she had imagined. Paco leaned back into the sumptuous inlay of the round sofa and draped his arm around Antonia.
So, Tony, I was thinking, you are so beautiful that I cannot be a selfish hombre and keep you all to myself.
Antonia momentarily stopped breathing, dreading what proposition might follow.
How would you like to be a featured dancer at my club? You can make $1,000 a night, up to 10 if you fancy a little extra work.
Antonia thought quickly. Paco was evidently fickle, as, only a few days before, she had been his exclusive executive assistant. Adopting a defenseless innocence, she looked up at his chiseled features with doughy eyes.
But Paco, I thought I was your exclusive girl Friday.
Paco laughed at her agile cunning, and Alejandro's poker face momentarily melted into a smile. Paco nodded.
Sure, Tony, maybe you need a little more time to settle in.
At that juncture, Alejandro felt his trouser pocket vibrate and he retrieved his phone. Checking his message, he turned decisively to Paco and announced,
Es la hora.
Paco's complexion darkened, and he clenched his outstretched hand into a fist.
Well, Tony, looks like we have some young punkies think they can do business in my backyard.
Paco rose in a decisive manner and motioned for Alejandro and Antonia to follow him. Alejandro checked the accessibility of his holstered gun under his sports jacket and followed his companions toward the main door of the club. Paco paused and turned to Alejandro.
Make sure the cameras outside the club are off.
Alejandro ran down the stairs and into a side office as Paco strode down in a more measured manner with Antonia in tow, garnering admiring glances from the patrons and dancers alike. In the meantime, Javier waited outside in the parking lot in a 1980s Plymouth Roadrunner that had seen better days. Its pair of twin headlamps illuminated the row of palm trees outside the Pink Pussycat, and three young men sat in the silence of anticipation. The engine continued to growl loudly and asthmatically until Chico decided to cut the ignition so they could discuss how the deal was going to go down. Alfredo sat beside Chico, who was by far the eldest and most street-hardened of the three amigos, while Javier, the kid of the crew, sat alone in the back street contemplating what he had gotten himself into. Javier leaned forward in the sudden deathly quiet and exhorted his older friend.
Hey Chico, are you sure I cannot come with you to make the deal?
No, Javier, this is too risky. See, you have two men on the door, and they are packing amigo. You just sit in the car and start the engine if the deal goes bad and we need to go gordo.
At that juncture, Two tall Hispanic men appeared at the door of the club with a pretty girl in a pink dress, one carrying a black briefcase in his left hand. The larger of the two men motioned for her to stay at the entrance behind the two doormen who advanced 20 paces behind the more fashionably dressed duo. Chico and Alfredo exchanged knowing glances, and Alfredo retrieved two machine pistols from the glove compartment. Alfredo gave one to Chico, and they checked their magazines and ensured that the safeties were off. Alfredo then removed the 2 bags of cocaine with the blue watermark on the seal on which the guns had been resting, and the two exited the vehicle in synchronized unison. Javier elastically worked his slender form over the back seat and slid into the driver's chair, poised to make a quick pickup and get away if the deal went sideways. Chico and Alfredo advanced side by side as brothers in arms, their machine pistols in their hands, as though clear declarations of intent. The two parties came to a halt in front of one another, at a distance of some 20 paces. Paco opened a dialogue as his 3 henchmen removed their revolvers and kept them lowered and ready. Paco sneered derisively.
So you two got some cojones. Coming into my territory selling yillo to me.
Chico stood his ground bravely, and spoke up.
We don't mean no offense, senor. We just got a consignment from a contact in Little Havana and thought you'd be interested in 4 keys.
Paco nodded pensively, deciding that he might have misjudged his new acquaintances.
4 keys, hey? Where did some little hustlers like you get 4 keys, hey?
Chico bristled at the slight but kept his nerve.
Alejandro says you are looking for 200.
Chico nodded affirmatively.
I can give you 100, if the yayo's pure Colombian.
2.
Responded Chico impassively. Paco grinned broadly.
So you do have some big cojones, niño. Maybe I could use a niño like you in my operation.
Paco turned to Alejandro and they exchanged wry and furtive glances.
Can I see the merchandise?
Paco's tone softened from a declaration of territory to a more business-like patois. Chico nodded, took 20 paces forward and handed one of the 2 bags to Paco, who inspected it under the streetlights. His mood darkened rapidly as he saw the blue watermark. These could only be the 2 missing bags from Key West.
Hey niño. Where did you say you got this yillo?
From a contact in Little Havana.
Paco's demeanor turned to a savage snarl.
Listen, niño. I don't think you are stupid enough to steal my yillo and then to come in front of me and try to sell it to my face. I will ask you again, who gave this to you?
Chico held his ground.
My contact, my secret.
Paco's patience snapped, and the inner hard man who had risen by brains and brawn rose to the fore, and he directed a powerful right hook at Chico's left temple, sending him sprawling and momentarily dazed to the floor. Alfredo, seeing Paco's men instinctively raising their weapons, opened fire with his machine pistol on Alejandro and his 2 doormen, winging Alejandro in the right shoulder, and putting down the larger of the 2 doormen who bore the brunt of the volley. Alejandro was forced to drop his sidearm, clutching his wounded shoulder. In an act of camaraderie, he bravely lunged across the line of fire, pushing Paco to the ground and shielding his boss with his own torso, while the last doorman standing returned fire, striking Alfredo in the head and the chest, and felling him instantly. Antonia felt a grip of panic and anxiety, and was frozen to the spot. Javier experienced a rush of adrenaline and started the car engine, accelerating as fast as he could to come to Chico's aid and place a steel wall between the doorman and his kinsman. Distracted and blinded by the headlamps, the doorman pivoted and fired his final 5 rounds at the onrushing juggernaut, smashing the windshield. Fortunately, his aim was wild, and Javier redirected the car and ran him down, feeling the suspension absorb the brutal shock as it silenced him for perpetuity. In these moments, Chico had regained his senses and, realizing the state of play, he rolled over, picked up the machine pistol and advanced menacingly toward the 2 men on the asphalt and stared them down. Paco looked up at his grimacing features as Alejandro began to lose consciousness from the loss of blood which had formed a pool by his side. Chico relished his moment of victory.
You think you can double deal, Chico, you mierda? You are no better than me. This is what you get for fucking with Chico.
With that, Chico emptied his clip into the two fallen men and coldly picked up Alejandro's briefcase, and, as he turned towards the car, he delivered the verdict on the night's melee.
There is always a colder reptile on the streets, Puerto.
Chico coolly got into the car and sped off with Javier, the 2 bags of cocaine and the money. Antonia rushed to the scene and wept as she witnessed the 5 dead bodies and, amongst them, the dying breaths of her benefactor Paco. She knelt by his side and cried inconsolably as police sirens filled the night air of Miami, the city in which sin never sleeps.